Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we will be sewing Danny Choo's free trouser pattern available on his website. Okay, so let's get started with getting the pockets ready. Grab the left pocket. This should be the smaller one. You want to fold over and top stitch the top edge only. This is that little extra pocket that jeans have that no one actually knows what to do with. Just a side note, I did decide to overlock this edge as my fabric is prone to fraying. So as you can see in the pattern, the smaller pocket will be stitched onto the slightly bigger pocket. So you just want to make sure to fold the right side in, there's a seam allowance, and top stitch this down onto the pocket. While I was at it, I did decide to do a narrow basting stitch around the bottom and the left side, just to keep it in place while I would be working with it. I like all the edges to be finished nicely, so I will overlock this. Just go nice and slow on these curves. If you don't have an overlocker or serger, you can always use a zigzag stitch on the edge. And this is where it comes in handy when you just baste that little edge down, so it doesn't move around while you're working with it. Now that you've got this, you want to grab your pocket lining. So you want to attach these two smaller pockets to this lining piece. You just want to sew around the bottom edge. This will fold over just like this, and it will be attached to the front of the jeans. So once it's sewn, you'll see that little pocket just perfectly fine. Just like before, you just want to do a narrow basting stitch to keep it in place. So now it's time to attach the front pockets to the front of the jeans. With the right sides together, place each of the pockets to the curve. Take your time to pin this in place so it doesn't shift, and sew this in place using your regular seam allowance. Also, don't be like me and just don't sew over your pins. I forgot my seam allowance, so ignore the double seam, but all you want to do is just trim the seam short, and then carefully, if you think it's needed, cut a few notches into that corner just to give it a bit of allowance so you can flip this over, and it will help it lay nice and flat once it's fully turned over. Just fold the lining to the back and pin this in place. So you just want to create a nice smooth curve. Your pocket should nicely fold over to show the smaller pocket. Next, you want to top stitch this curve. Just make sure the pocket is out of the way if you want a working pocket. So somehow I lost a clip of me sewing this, so I'll show you on this instead. To close the bottom of the pocket, you want to start by lining the pocket up with how it should be. Then turning and putting the right sides together, you want to pin the bottom and sew. I also overlocked this edge. So all you need to do now is push your point through to get it back right sides out, and if you look to your back, you've got a beautiful, nice, crisp, finished edge. Take some time to iron this nice and flat just to create that crisp edge and to keep it in place for the rest of the project. Just to make sure it stays in place as one piece and to make it easier to work with, I baste that little bit of a top edge down just so it doesn't fall back all the time. Now it's time for the back pockets. So same as before, you just want to fold over the top edge and top stitch this down. Again, I overlocked the top edge. The pattern tends to indicate a double stitch line for most of these top stitches, which I haven't done, but on this piece I decided to do that. Sewing this decorative stitch on the pocket is a little bit more difficult, but to make it easier myself, I decided to use a pin to mark the start and end, as well as that little center point, so I knew where it needed to come to. I then used a piece of chalk to transfer these markings and draw out the sewing line. Because my fabric has a bit of stretch in it, I decided to use the same technique and just use that interfacing on the bottom. I took it nice and slow just to sew the curve, and then making a sharp turn by leaving the needle in and lifting the foot, I created the other side of the curve. Just take your time on this one. I knew I wasn't going to be too perfect, so I didn't have my heart set on it. So it's slightly off kilter, but I'm happy with that. And once everything is sewn, this interfacing rips nice and easy, just off the stitches. And just make sure to cut all those little threads off, as you don't want those later in your project. Again, just because my fabric does tend to fray a bit, I overlooked all these edges on each of the pockets, just to keep it nice and neat. To make this next step easier, I really do recommend just taking your time to iron these edges down. I decided to do each of the two sides first, and then I went back once it was cooled slightly to do the bottom two edges, making sure to keep that point. Time to attach the pockets to the back of the jeans. So just making sure to line this up nicely, I decided to use the pattern to try and lift it and then slide it onto my actual fabric. This did take a little bit of finicking, but I ended up using my thumb to measure just to make sure, and hey, if it works, why not? Just pin this in place before top stitching. To make it easier, I did do these sharp turns by just leaving the needle in the fabric, lifting the foot and just turning it, just like we did before. So don't worry about the chalk marks, this will eventually rub off, or if you really want to, you can use a bit of water. So now that the pockets are attached, it's time for the back yoke. So as you can see in this pattern, it clearly indicates center back is the curve, and then just make sure to line the center back up with your pattern piece, because there really is a back to it, just keep that in mind. So with the right sides together and the back is to the back, you just want to pin this in place before sewing. And this is what it will look like. I just decided to overlook the edge, as you can see, and now you just want to top stitch this. Just make sure the little seam is facing towards the top when you're top stitching, so you're actually catching it. And this is what you should have now. 2 times the back side with the pocket and the yoke, and 2 front pieces with the pocket. Just face the right sides together, lining up the side seam. So I like to do this by pinning the bottom and the top first, just making sure these are nicely lined up before pinning the center bits. So just take your time and actually pin this in place. It makes things a whole lot easier when you're actually sewing it and you're not accidentally stretching your fabric that way. If you've got a stretch, that is, like I do. And just sew this in place with your regular seam allowance. And this is what you have now. It may look a bit weird, but trust me, it's the process. I just like to top stitch this side seam by making sure the seam is facing the back and just taking my time to top stitch this, which really works well because it keeps that seam out of the way for the rest of the project and nice and flat. You can also just give this a good press afterwards, just make sure your seams are nice and crisp. Up next, we're going to sew this back seam only. Remember the back pockets? That's your back. So that's the bigger curve, so just pin the top and the center first, and then pin in the middle. Sew the seam using your regular seam allowance, and then if you want to, overlock this edge afterwards. I've done that. So once you've overlocked the edge, you just want to open it up, and just like we did on the side seam, you want to just do a little top stitching down the side. And just remember to catch your seam. This is a little bit difficult, so you do need to do a bit of stretching and maneuvering it around, but it's really nice when you've done it. Now it's time for the belt loops. So I just decided to overlock the 2 edges first before taking it to the ironing board and just gently folding it into 3s basically, and just taking my time to iron this. It really does make sewing a lot easier, and it saves you from having to use thousands of pins to keep it in place. I top stitched it down both sides to keep it nice and flat and in place. I then used a piece of chalk to use it to mark where I needed to cut, just using the pattern as a referencing guide, just to make things a bit easier for me. And don't stress if your top stitching hasn't completely caught the sides, it's all good. So the placement of your belt loops is shown on the pattern, but I placed it in the center, then in line with the back pocket, and finally in the center of the front pockets as well. Take your time sewing these in place, doing a couple of back and forth stitches just to reinforce these. They will most likely be pulled on to a few times when getting the pants on and off. So it's quite important that these are strong. Up next is the waistband, which I handily decided to label belt. So you need one of the lining and one of your actual fabric. I overlocked the bottom of the lining fabric just to make it a bit easier later on. With the right sides together, pin along the inner curve, just to keep it in place, and then sew it with your regular seam allowance. So on these little side seams, I did about 2/3 down. This is just going to make it a bit easier when attaching the waistband if you don't sew it all the way to the bottom. Just clip these corners off to the edge there, just so it's going to make it a bit easier as well to turn this corner to keep it nice and sharp. I'm using a nail file just to help me because it's sharp but not too sharp that it's going to keep coming through the fabric. So once you've got these corners turned out, just turn your fabric nice and flat and just pin it in place. Just make sure that you've got the seam that's nicely inside and you've got it nice and crisp. It's time to attach the waistband. So I'm actually using the pattern here just to mark my center back seam. I just thought it might be a little bit easier compared to my usual technique, but I don't think it should matter. So I'm just lining this up with the center belt loop. Just make sure your belt loops are still down. Trust me, that's how you need it. And just take your time to pin this in place, making sure that the belt loops are not folded or anything. It's gonna make it a lot easier if you just make sure everything's out of the way. Just with these sides, you do want to fold over. If you just check your pattern, there is the left side, I'm pretty sure, just needs to be folded in further, which you can see I didn't pay attention to, and it's gonna bite me in the behind later on. So do have a look on your pattern to make sure which side actually has a bigger seam allowance on this bit here. Because as you can see, I'm actually pulling my fabric to help it line up a bit. But it worked out fine enough for me. After sewing this seam, I just like to overlock it because there's quite a few layers of fabric, so this is just a way to nicely secure it in place. Also, if you don't have this, I do recommend just using the zigzag stitch on this part. Again, just to keep it secure. Flipping the waistband, just push that sewn seam up, and then you want to tuck the white lining underneath it. You don't need to do any tucking around the edge, just push it straight down. It's an overlocked edge, that's why we overlocked it. As you can see though, I did push that white lining around the corner there back, just so that it wouldn't be seen later on. On the remainder of the pinning, just make sure it's pushed nicely so that there's no accidental tucking. I then top stitch the bottom, just taking my time here. I'm using a special foot that's got like a little mark on there so that I can make sure that it's going exactly next to that ditch, as it's called, the sewn seam, and I can have a nice even edge on both sides. Now it's finally time to do those belt loops that have just been hanging there for a while. So you want to tuck over that top edge and just leave a little bit down the bottom as well, just a bit of room, so if you do end up using a belt, there's the room there. So just tuck it in. You can pin that in place, which I did do and then removed it. And you want to just sew over it a good couple of times just so it's nice and strong and in place, because these could be tucked on quite a few times when you're putting it on or putting a belt through it. So it's just good if they're strong. And now that the top of the belt loops have been sewn, I just like to go back in and sew those bottom of the loops as well. Just nice finishing touch there. It was at this point that I decided to do the fly and realized I should have left a bigger seam allowance on one of the two sides. So this is me trying to figure out which side I even need to sew the detail onto. And yeah, kind of realizing, but it wasn't too much of a problem. Just later on you watch me unpick a little bit just to make the next part easier. You can also do this step after the next. So if you just want to watch the full thing, and then I can let you know. So anyway, I used a pin, my usual marking tool, just to mark where it would end up going and just folding my pattern to make it easier to do so. So with the two pins in place, I just used another piece of chalk, just like before, and just draw out where I needed to sew. Just take your time when sewing the seam, especially around the bottom bit. It is a tight curve, so you may need to lift your foot and leave the needle in and turn it a couple of times. I probably should have done that. I just winged it and worked out alright. I also went back and just did another second seam on the inside, which also helped catch my seam, which was slightly shorter than it should have been. So hence the seam on the inside. Remember how I said I had to unpick part of it? Yeah, this is it. So I decided to make it easier to sew that inner curve, I had to unpick part of that detail we just sewed. This is where I probably recommend to do it after you sewed that inner curve, but then you're still gonna struggle either way because this is now closed. So it's up to you which way you want to do it because it's still a struggle. Anyway, once it's all sewn around the edge, I did not overlock it or anything and just turned it inside out. So you can now do that inner curve, which you need to fix anyways. So that back seam that we top stitch, we just want to repeat that on the front just to keep it nice and consistent. It's a bit of a struggle, so you just need to get it underneath, but it looks really nice once it's done. So now it's time to hem your jeans. The best way to do this is just to fold it over once. So I have overlocked this bottom edge as well as all the way around each side, just so we've got nice finished edges to work with. So I'm using the pattern again just to mark with my pins where the seam allowance goes. Just to make things again a bit easier and even actually. That's just really the thing, just nice and even. And when that's done, you can just transfer these pins by folding them over and pinning them in place. And just top stitch this in place. To create that nice finished hem that most jeans seem to have, I decided to do a second seam beside it, just to have that kind of the twin needle look or the cover stitch overlocker look. And now that you've got this, it's finally time for the most exciting part. It is finishing up and closing these jeans. So this is where it's finally going to start looking like an actual pair of jeans. So just turn it inside out and line up the bottom edges as well as the crotch edges. And this is the easiest way to sew it in place. So once it's all pinned, you just want to sew your regular seam allowance and just go all around. Just make a nice smooth curve around the crotch as well. Now it's all closed and sewn down each side, it's time to turn it inside out and find out what it actually looks like. So turning inside out is a bit of a mission, but take your time. So once these are all turned inside out, I actually just like to separate the seam since I can and just sew this in place. It just gives me a nicer feeling about the finished look. You can just leave it, it honestly doesn't matter or anything. Finish this off, I'm just using these no-sew snap fasteners that I bought at the dollar store. I've actually got one underneath here because I struggled. It's quite a thick fabric, it's got a lot of layers, So you just need to take your time on this. It took me quite a while and a lot of hammering to get this in place. I know there's a tool for it and I just don't have it. So for now, this is it. So after a while, I did end up getting it to work, thank God. Now it's time for round 2. So round 2 was no less any more fun. So again, just hammer, hammer, hammer away until finally you've got a snap that doesn't come off after you snap it together, which is the best thing. And then I just tested that I can actually do it for a couple of times, and if I can, then it's done. And that's it, we are finally done. Like this video and comment down below, I love hearing from you all. And don't forget to just subscribe to my channel, and while you're at it, press that notification bell. And I'll see you all next time. Bye!